Jane Fonda. The name alone feels larger than life. Beauty, rebellion, and brilliance wrapped into one. She was the queen of workout tapes, the Hollywood rebel with 2 Oscars, and the activist who made headlines around the world. But here's the thing. Behind the glamorous red carpets and glossy magazine covers, her story was never picture perfect. It was darker, messier, and at times, devastating. From a childhood scarred by tragedy, to marriages that left her broken, to a single photo that nearly destroyed her career, Jane Fonda's life has been a war between what the world saw and what she was secretly enduring. And just when she thought she'd survived it all, her biggest battles came later, when her own body turned against her. But somehow, through every scandal, heartbreak, and illness, Jane didn't just survive. She kept reinventing herself again and again. And the truth about how she pulled it off is even more shocking than her controversies. Before we begin this journey through the life of Jane Fonda, I'd be grateful if you tapped the like button and subscribed, only if you feel at home here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. It's always a joy seeing how many corners of the world we're all connected from.
Before Jane Fonda became Hollywood's ultimate rebel, she was just a little girl growing up in the shadow of a father who never really let her in. Henry Fonda, a titan of cinema, respected worldwide, a man whose name carried weight in every studio lot. But to Jane, he was a ghost in plain sight, distant, critical, almost impossible to please. Praise didn't exist. Hugs weren't part of the vocabulary. Affection came in the form of corrections. If she wasn't slim enough, polished enough, perfect enough, she felt like she didn't matter. And just when she needed love the most, her world collapsed. At only 12 years old, Jane lost her mother in the most devastating way imaginable. The official story handed to her was vague, almost sterile. Heart failure, they said. No one explained, no one comforted, no one even allowed her to grieve. Her mother's photos vanished from the house as if she had never existed. It was silence. And that silence cut deeper than words ever could. But secrets have a way of finding their way out. Weeks later, in a jarring, almost cruel twist, Jane learned the truth not from her father, not from her family, but from a magazine. One cold sentence in print that no child should ever read. Her mother had taken her own life. For Jane, the shock was unbearable. She carried guilt like a hidden scar. She remembered not going downstairs the night before to say goodnight. And in her mind, that tiny, innocent decision turned into a lifelong torment. Maybe if she had gone down, maybe if she had said something, maybe her mother would have stayed. That's the irrational cruelty grief plays on a child. And Jane was left to bear it all alone. Her father didn't console her. He didn't even explain. He simply carried on, as if nothing had happened. And so Jane learned to do the same. She stopped asking questions. She stopped expecting love. She built a shell around herself, poised, disciplined, perfect on the outside, but hollow and aching within. And here's the haunting part. That silence, that absence, that desperate hunger to be seen and loved, it never left her. It followed her into adulthood, into Hollywood, and into every relationship she ever had. But at the time, Jane's only escape was performance. If she couldn't be loved for who she was, maybe she could be admired for what she did, and that mindset would fuel her rise, but also nearly destroy her. But if you think her childhood was tragic, what came next in Hollywood was even more brutal.
By the time the 1960s rolled around, Jane Fonda had everything a rising star was supposed to have. A famous last name, a face the cameras loved, and a body that magazines couldn't get enough of. She was splashed across covers, hailed as one of Hollywood's newest beauties, and catapulted into the spotlight. To the outside world, she looked flawless. But the truth, she was unraveling. The glamour, the red carpets, the applause, none of it fixed what was broken inside. In fact, the more the world adored her, the more she despised herself. Behind closed doors, Jane fought a hidden war with bulimia. endless cycles of binging and purging, punishing herself in secret, desperate to gain control of something in a world where she felt utterly powerless. She later admitted she couldn't even look at herself in the mirror. She hated her body, hated the image staring back at her. And Hollywood, instead of helping, it poured gasoline on the fire. Executives fed her cruelty disguised as advice. One studio figure even suggested she undergo jaw surgery and remove molars to make her face slimmer on screen. And the shocking part? Jane actually considered it. This wasn't vanity, this was survival. She believed that if she wasn't perfect, if she didn't meet the impossible standards set for her, she'd vanish, just like her mother. So she turned to plastic surgery. Not for fame, not for ego, but for worthiness. Every procedure was a desperate plea. Am I good enough now? But the mirror was never satisfied. Her 20s, the years most people remember as golden, were anything but golden for Jane. They were filled with shame, self-loathing, and a crushing loneliness hidden under flawless gowns and photo shoots. She was the picture of poise, elegance, and confidence to the world. But in her own words, she never thought she'd live past 30. That's how deep the pain went. What Hollywood saw was a rising star. What they didn't see was the collapse happening just out of frame. A woman terrified she'd never be loved, burying herself under layers of makeup, dieting, and desperation. But Jane wasn't about to stay trapped in that cycle forever. Because soon, she would stop performing just to please others and start using her roles to tell the truth. And when she did, Hollywood didn't just take notice. It crowned her with its highest honor.
Something shifted for Jane in the late 1960s. She was done being Hollywood's ornament. The constant pressure to be thin, perfect, and silent had carved deep wounds, but it also gave her a fire. If she was going to survive in this industry, she wasn't going to do it by playing harmless beauties anymore. She was going to tell the truth, even if it made people uncomfortable. Her real breakthrough came in 1969 with They Shoot Horses, Don't They? A brutal film about a desperate dance marathon during the Great Depression. Jane didn't just act in that movie. She poured out every ounce of pain she'd been hiding for years. The anguish in her eyes wasn't fake. The exhaustion, the despair, the rage, that was real. It was the closest thing to therapy she'd ever had, and audiences felt it. Hollywood couldn't ignore her anymore. 2 years later came Clute, 1971, the role that earned Jane her first Oscar. She played Bree Daniels, a call girl tangled in danger and desire, a role many thought would be reduced to cliché. But Jane ripped the stereotype apart and rebuilt it from the inside out. She gave Bree vulnerability, intelligence, and a desperate search for identity in a world that only saw her as an object. That wasn't just a character, that was Jane, telling her own truth through someone else's skin. And for the first time, she wasn't just admired, she was respected. By 1978, she had solidified her power with Coming Home. Playing a woman who falls in love with a paralyzed Vietnam veteran, Jane delivered one of the rawest human performances of her life. The tears were real. The empathy was lived. The Academy gave her a second Oscar, but the award wasn't the point. What mattered was that Jane had finally taken control of her own narrative. She wasn't waiting for the studios to hand her scraps anymore. She co-founded her own production company, almost unheard of for women at the time, and started making films with purpose. War, healing, justice, feminism. If it didn't matter, she didn't want it. And that's when Jane became dangerous. She wasn't just a star anymore, she was a voice. A woman who refused to play by the rules of a system designed to silence her. But with every bold move came consequences, because while Hollywood was learning to respect her, America was about to turn against her. And it all came down to one photograph. The image that nearly destroyed her career forever.
By the early 1970s, Jane Fonda wasn't just an actress anymore, she was a force. The roles she chose had meaning. She spoke out on war, on justice, on feminism. She wasn't afraid of criticism, and that made her magnetic. But it also made her dangerous to the establishment. And in 1972, one moment would change the way millions of Americans saw her. That summer, Jane traveled to Vietnam. Her intention wasn't to stir outrage, it was to witness the human cost of war firsthand. She visited hospitals, schools, and families who had been devastated by years of conflict. She listened to their stories. She tried to understand suffering beyond the headlines. In her heart, it was about compassion. But then came the photo, a single snapshot that would haunt her for decades. Jane, seated near anti-aircraft equipment, smiling awkwardly. It lasted seconds, a meaningless pose during a long trip. But when that image hit American newspapers, the fallout was explosive. Overnight, she went from Oscar-winning actress to public enemy number one. The media branded her Hanoi Jane. Veterans groups called for boycotts. Politicians slammed her as un-American. Movie offers slowed. And in living rooms across the country, Jane Fonda became a symbol of betrayal. The irony? That single picture had almost nothing to do with her actual mission. But perception is everything, and in this case, perception crushed her. Years later, Jane admitted that moment was one of the biggest regrets of her life. Not because she cared about the backlash, but because she understood how painful that image was for American soldiers and their families. She clarified over and over. She never meant to offend, never meant to disrespect. Her intention was to bring voices of suffering to the surface, not to insults the people fighting overseas. Still, apologies couldn't erase the damage. Once a country turns on you, it takes years to recover. And Jane had to live with that scarlet letter, Hanoi Jane, burned into her name. But here's where Jane proved what made her different. Instead of retreating, instead of disappearing into exile, she doubled down. In 1978, she produced and starred in Coming Home, a film that honored veterans returning from Vietnam. It wasn't just a performance, it was an olive branch, a way to tell the stories that had been ignored. The Academy gave her another Oscar, but more importantly, audiences began to see her not as a traitor, but as someone who was willing to learn, to listen, and to face pain head-on. The controversy never fully faded, but Jane didn't let it define her. If anything, it hardened her resolve. She learned that public perception could shift in an instant, but strength, conviction, and persistence, that's what lasts. And yet, while the world judged her, her personal life was collapsing behind closed doors. Because if Hollywood was brutal, her marriages were even worse. And what happened inside those relationships exposed an entirely different side of Jane Fonda's struggle.
For all her power on screen, Jane Fonda's private life was a battlefield of its own. 3 marriages, each starting with promise and passion, each ending in disappointment and emptiness. Her first marriage came in 1965, when Jane was just 27. She married French filmmaker Roger Vadim, the man famous for turning women into international sex symbols. He had already been with screen sirens like Brigitte Bardot, and now he saw Jane as his newest muse. Under his direction, she transformed into Barbarella, the space-age seductress that turned her into an icon of sensuality worldwide. But behind closed doors, the glow of Barbarella faded fast. Vadim pushed Jane into roles that showcased her body while she craved depth and substance. Their values clashed constantly. He wanted spectacle, she wanted meaning. And when their daughter Vanessa was born in 1968, Jane tried to step into motherhood. But guilt haunted her. She later admitted she felt like a photograph in Vanessa's childhood, present in pictures but emotionally absent in real life. By 1973, the marriage crumbled. Jane walked away, taking her daughter with her, leaving behind not just a husband, but an entire version of herself. Her second marriage took her in a completely different direction. In 1973, Jane married activist Tom Hayden, one of the most outspoken political figures of the era. For Jane, this wasn't just romance, it was redemption. With Tom, she believed she had found a deeper purpose: activism, justice, revolution. Together they fought for causes, marched in protests, and even co-founded nonprofits. In 1973, their son Troy was born. But motherhood didn't bring the peace she hoped for. Jane struggled to balance being the perfect mother with being the perfect activist. She admitted later that she never really knew how to be a mom. Perfection became a prison. She raced between fundraising events and bedtime stories, always feeling like she was failing at both. And in the end, Tom saw Jane more as a symbol than a partner. They divorced in 1990, leaving Jane with a powerful legacy of activism but a painful emptiness at home. Then came marriage number 3. In 1991, Jane married media mogul Ted Turner, the billionaire founder of CNN. At first, it seemed like the fairy tale ending. Turner gave her security, success, and a break from the chaos of politics and protests. They lived in mansions, attended galas, flew on private jets, the classic power couple life. But beneath the glamour, Jane felt herself disappearing again. Roger Vadim wanted a muse, Tom Hayden wanted a comrade, and Ted Turner, he wanted a polished partner to fit the frame. Her voice, her fire, her individuality, all of it was slowly being muted. By 2001, Jane realized even comfort could be a cage. She walked away from the wealth, the estates, the status, choosing instead something she had never really claimed before: herself. For the first time in decades, she didn't belong to a man, a movement, or a mold. She belonged to Jane. But the cost of those marriages ran deep. They left scars on her and guilt when it came to her children. And if you think marriage was tough, the battles waiting for her in the years ahead would push her body and soul to the absolute limit. Because Jane Fonda's hardest fight wasn't with Hollywood or husbands. It was with her own health.
After decades of surviving Hollywood, scandals, and heartbreak, Jane Fonda's greatest battles weren't against the critics or even the men who underestimated her. They came from within her own body. In 2010, at the age of 72, Jane was diagnosed with breast cancer. A lumpectomy saved her life, but the emotional aftermath lingered. Cancer doesn't just scar your body, it rewires the way you see time. Suddenly, life didn't stretch endlessly ahead of her. It became fragile, urgent, unpredictable. But cancer wasn't done with her. In 2019, doctors found a small lesion on her lip, skin cancer. The treatment was relatively minor, but the message hit like a warning shot. Time was closing in. And then in 2022 came the heaviest blow of all: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. At 84 years old, when most people are quietly retreating into old age, Jane Fonda was bracing herself for chemotherapy. And she didn't hide it. She went public with her diagnosis, speaking openly about treatment, about exhaustion, about fear. She wanted others battling illness to know they weren't alone. That kind of courage is easy to admire, but behind the brave face was a quieter, lonelier reality. Hospital rooms with their sterile walls, IV lines, the constant hum of medical machines. Nights where she lay awake, remembering the fierce, unstoppable woman she had been, and wondering if that fire was still inside her. Jane admitted later, "I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of reaching the end with regrets." And that's what haunted her most. The birthdays she missed, the calls she didn't make, the moments when work, fame, or causes had come first. That guilt never disappeared. It just softened, sitting inside her like a shadow. Even after treatment, she faced the same enemy we all do: time. Her body ached, her spine curved, her once razor-sharp memory began to flicker. And perhaps the cruelest part was solitude. After 3 failed marriages, and with her children living lives of their own, Jane faced her hardest battle largely alone. Not unloved, but without anyone by her side day after day. She had wealth, she had legacy, but none of it held her hand at night. And yet, this is what makes Jane extraordinary. She didn't let illness define her. When she walked out of chemo, thinner, quieter, but smiling, she gave the world one of her most powerful reminders. Beauty is not in youth or perfection, it's in persistence, in rising each day with grace, even when your body says no. Her health battles didn't weaken her legacy, they deepened it. They revealed the raw truth of Jane Fonda, not just an icon of film or activism, but a woman who endured with resilience, even when the cameras were gone. But as time slowed her down, Jane discovered something she had been chasing all her life. Not fame, not romance, not applause, but peace. And it's in those final chapters that Jane Fonda finally found redemption.
After all the storms, Hollywood's cruelty, the scandal that nearly erased her career, the failed marriages, and the battles with her own body, Jane Fonda finally began to discover the one thing she had been chasing since childhood: peace. It didn't come in the form of another award or a new romance or a perfect role. It came in the quiet moments, with her children, with her father, with herself. Her relationship with her kids, Vanessa and Troy, had always been complicated. For years, she carried guilt, convinced she had failed them as a mother. But over time, through honesty and painful conversations, they found healing. Jane learned to apologize with her whole heart. Not excuses, not explanations, just truth. And slowly, trust was rebuilt. Dinners became softer, laughter easier, and the shadow of absence began to lift. And then there was her father, Henry Fonda, the man whose distance had haunted her since childhood. For most of her life, she craved his approval and never got it. But in 1981, while filming on Golden Pond, something miraculous happened. During a scene that mirrored their fractured relationship, Jane's character reached out to her father, and Henry, not the actor, but the man, broke down in tears. For the first time, Jane saw him not as a legend, not as a cold figure, but as her father. Months later, he passed away. But before he did, Jane whispered the words her younger self had longed to say: "I love you. I forgive you. I hope you forgive me." It was late, but it was real, and it was enough. Today, at 87, Jane Fonda no longer lives in the glare of flashbulbs. Her Los Angeles home is quiet, filled with books, nature, and reflection. Romance no longer rules her life. She's embraced solitude not as loneliness, but as freedom. "I don't have time for it," she once said, with pace in her voice, not bitterness. Her fortune is massive, over $200 million, built not just from films, but from fitness tapes, smart investments, and decades of work. But wealth isn't her legacy. Her real inheritance to the world is resilience. She redefined beauty not as youth, but as persistence. She redefined strength, not as perfection, but the ability to rise after every fall. Jane Fonda's life is not the story of a flawless icon. It's the story of a woman who endured through tragedy, scandal, love, illness, and time, and came out the other side not broken, but whole. And maybe that's her greatest role of all.
Jane Fonda's journey forces us to ask, what really defines a legacy? Awards? Wealth? Fame? Or is it the way a person keeps fighting, keeps evolving, and keeps finding purpose, even when the world thinks they're finished? For Jane, the answer is clear. Her legacy isn't just in the movies or the protests or the billions of headlines. It's in the way she transformed pain into power and left behind proof that survival can be its own form of greatness. But what do you think? After everything she's lived through, the tragedy, the reinventions, the battles. How would you rate Jane Fonda's legacy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if her story touched you today, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories of resilience and survival. Because in the end, Jane Fonda didn't just play strong women on screen, she lived it every single day.